Hello students, once again we are continuing Unit 4, Notes 4 on the Progressive Era. This is part 2. We were talking about Jacob A. Riis, who was a photographer at the turn of the century, and he had the idea to use his photography to expose what life was like for the poor immigrants and the poor people living in some of the extreme poverty conditions and working in extreme poverty conditions. The Gilded Age, we talked about this metaphor back a couple of different times in this unit so far. That whole idea of gilding something is to put a fine layer of gold on the outside surface, but underneath it's not necessarily very valuable. So we called this era the Gilded Age because on the surface we've got these people with incredible and massive amounts of wealth, but that is just a fine layer of our surface for our country and society, and underneath we have the reality that most people were living in poverty, extreme poverty. Okay, the wealthy lived like royalty, but they were seemingly unaware of the dismal poverty that many others faced. Jacob A. Riis was kind of irritated with this mentality that these super wealthy people are living these opulent lives, not really recognizing the fact that their wealth came on the backs of these poor workers who lived in those crowded, nasty tenements, and their lives were so much more difficult. So he wanted to expose these rich people to the realities of life for those in poverty. Photojournalism became a way for reformers like Jacob A. Riis to bring attention to the struggle that a large percentage of citizens faced in their lives of poverty. Riis published his book, How the Other Half Lives, and showed his photos to wealthy Americans to expose the poverty that so many people were facing every day. So you're going to write for the solution. The solution was to publish articles and use photography to show wealthy Americans what it was like for people in poverty. And you're going to write down Jacob A. Riis photographed How the Other Half Live to show the living conditions of people in poverty. You can kind of see his slideshow going on in the background. Those are some of his photographs that he took as he kind of toured through different cities, mainly New York City, taking photographs of people in the tenements that they lived in their workplaces, showing what life was like living and working as someone, as one of these poorer people. Okay. Reformers in the Progressive Era were working hard to improve the lives of workers, both adult and children. Remember, we talked a lot about child labor when we were looking at our Fezziwig Day and looking at the era where even across the world, London, in the United States, in our cities too, people were hiring young children to do really dangerous jobs. These children were unable to get an education because their families needed them to work. They were living in such poverty that they weren't going to get to eat. They didn't know where their meal was going to come from unless they made sure that their kids were working and employed and making money as well. Adult workers were also up against many challenges. More immigrants meant more potential employees. Businesses could find replacements so easily if an employee complained about the long hours, or low pay, hazardous working conditions. So if you dared ask for a raise, they would pretty much fire you because they've got a line of 1,000 people just got off the boat from immigrating from another country, and they need the work. So the problem, working conditions for laborers were unsafe and unfair. Many children were also working dangerous jobs instead of getting an education. Reformers like Samuel Gompers starts a labor union called the AFL, American Federation for Labor, and Mother Mary Jones, she gets the nickname Mother Jones. She gets that nickname because she is real passionate about ending child labor. So both of these reformers worked to unify workers through labor unions and give employees a voice. Mother Mary Jones also held rallies and basically parades of children saying these children deserve an education and not a life of working in these awful and dangerous factories and mines and other places. So some unions organized strikes to stand up to powerful businesses, to powerful business owners, to convince them to make wages fair and workplaces safer. Solution was to organize workers into labor unions, to have a stronger voice and demand better working conditions, to pass laws to also passed laws to outlaw hiring children and require mandatory education. And we call that compulsory education. So they passed compulsory education laws to make sure that kids were going to school. That's why you're here today. Okay, Samuel Gompers and Mother Mary Jones. You're going to write down for Samuel Gompers that he helped establish the American Federation of Labor to unionize workers. And Mother Jones fought for safer working conditions, shorter work days, and an end to child labor. You can remember that Mother Jones is watching out for her children. Okay, some of the things that they were striking and asking for. We talked about the strikes, the coal strikes, the miners in 1907, I think it was, in Minnesota. It wasn't a very successful strike in terms of that they didn't get what they were asking for, but it sure did make a pretty big statement. Another issue at this time period was racial inequality. We talked about how we had cracks in our cups after that Civil War, and this is an example of some of those flaws that we still have to work through. During the era of Reconstruction after the U.S. Civil War, Southern states had passed laws meant to segregate people in public places based on race. We called those Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. Okay, violence was also an issue. Between 1892 and 1903, 3,000 African Americans were lynched across the South. Lynching is another word for basically being snatched up, kidnapped, and hung. And usually it was pretty rudimentary, like they would just hang them from a nearby tree. It was pretty brutal and it's disgusting, and it caused many African Americans in the South to live in fear. African Americans argued that segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment and the government should protect citizens from these discriminatory laws. They also wanted protection from the violence. Homer Plessy was arrested for resisting segregation and refusing to obey a Jim Crow law. The law that he was refusing to follow was that he was supposed to ride and wait in a segregated waiting area at the train station for colored people. It was labeled, and he did not, and he bought a first class train ticket. He was going to ride in first class, but because he's mixed race, they considered him to be black and colored, and therefore he was supposed to wait in the colored area. You can see up here there were restrooms for white people and restrooms for African Americans or people who were not white, basically. We'll talk more about this later on here too, but segregation was legalized when the Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, African Americans continued living with inequality. So Plessy's court case went all the way before the Supreme Court, and they ruled that as long as the facilities, the public facilities for black people were equal to those of white people, that they could continue having these segregation laws. And so that was an issue. So here's two photographs. Up here we see a photograph of a white public school in the South, and here's a photograph of the black public school in the South. Plessy and other people looking at this, anyone looking at these differences can obviously see that they're not really that equal looking. Here's a white schoolroom. Here's how the black students were expected to learn. Okay, so Homer and other people are looking at this and going, this is not even remotely equal. I don't know how anyone can think that it is. So solutions provide better education, opportunities for African Americans, and organize to fight segregation laws and work for equal rights. There are going to be a couple of reformers who have a little bit different philosophy about what solutions are best for African Americans. But at this point, anyone can look between those photographs and ask the same question that Homer is asking right here. How is this equal? Reformers working to bring about racial equality during the Progressive Era had different ideas about how to respond to segregation. Booker T. Washington was born a slave. He believed that education was the only answer to get people out of this situation. He felt African Americans could create their own opportunities and still get a quality education. His mentality was a little bit more like, if the whites don't want us in their schools, we don't need them. We shouldn't rely on white people to give us our education. We can do it ourselves, and we can do it better than anyone can. So he established an all-black college called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Okay, so there's a photograph of some men who were going to doing some studies at the Tuskegee Institute. These men actually help us during World War II. These are the Tuskegee Airmen, and they're doing some scientific work for flight and things like that. We'll talk about them in our next unit. W.E.B. Du Bois took a little bit different approach. He felt we don't need to put up with this. The situation is not separate but equal. It's just separate and unequal. And he felt that African Americans needed to fight segregation rather than what he felt Booker T. Washington was advocating was to just live with it and work around it. He said that this is unfair. We need to legally fight racial injustices like this. And so he founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that organization still exists today, and they help represent people who legally have been mistreated because of their race. So for the notes you're going to write down, establish the NAACP to fight segregation and expand equal rights for blacks. Okay. Then we have people working towards women's suffrage. Women have been trying to gain voting rights or suffrage since before the Civil War. In 1890, the movement began to gain women's suffrage gained strength. Susan B. Anthony led the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. This reform movement focused on trying to change voting laws state by state to expand voting rights to women. Remember, we talked about states made the laws on who could vote at that time, so each state had to decide for itself how much women could vote and what types of elections they could vote in. We talked about this with our Minnesota studies as well. Progress was slow. By 1900, only 4 states, all of them out in the West, had granted women's suffrage. The Progressive Era helped reinvigorate the suffrage movement and expanded the focus nationally. We didn't really talk about Susan B. Anthony last year in 6th grade, but we did talk about Clara Euland, who was a progressive woman of her day here in Minneapolis, and she organized a women's voting rights march through Minneapolis. And she also was working to improve conditions for children and trying to get Minnesota to provide opportunities for kindergartens. The solution for the problem? Unite women in organizations like the NAWSA and the NWP, which we'll talk about next, to work for women's voting rights. Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony led the NAWSA in 1890 to fight for states to give women voting rights. But this isn't going to be enough for many women, so we're going to talk about another reformer. In 1916, a young woman named Alice Paul formed what came to be known as the National Women's Party. The NWP differed from the NAWSA in that these women focused on passing a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, which means if it's in the Constitution, every single state has to abide by it. So there's Alice Paul, famous photo of her holding up a toast to women's suffrage and women's voting rights. To expand awareness for their movement, Alice Paul petitioned the White House. She took her request directly to President Woodrow Wilson. They held rallies and they would march right in front of the White House. She and other suffragettes, women who were working for suffrage, were arrested for blocking the sidewalk. While in jail, Paul and her supporters went on a hunger strike. Jailers force-fed them. The public became enraged, and this brought enough attention to move Congress forward. The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. The 19th Amendment is the amendment that gives women the right to vote. So in your timeline, please write down for 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed. Okay? And we're going to have to stop here once again and finish up in part 3. So thank you for listening to part 2 of the Progressive Era Notes. Make sure that you finish up by watching part 3.